everyone. That music is La Danse du Grand Calomé de la Paix, also called La Danse des Sauvages, from the opera-ballet Les Indes Galantes, composed by Jean-Philippe Rameau and performed by Les Arts Florissants. And this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Podbean, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description, and sign up at any level, even if it's just $1. So regular listeners to this podcast will know that this is a new piece of music that I've used here in the intro, different from what I usually have in the past. And I picked out this piece of music for one thing because this episode is sort of transitional. This is Myth of the Month number 25 on nations. And 25 is kind of a round number, and I am planning after this point to take a bit of a pause and a step back as far as myths of the month. Up to this point, I've covered a lot of the really important ones that I wanted to discuss from the beginning. Capitalism, the Enlightenment, and so on. One exception I haven't gotten to yet is the economy, which is a significant one. But with this one, with nations, I basically have hit the major ones now that I wanted to get to. And so I expect sometime after this I'll post sort of a retrospective looking back at and considering the different subjects we've talked about and the different reactions I've had to different myths of the month over these last several years. And then I think I might take a bit of a step back and work more on other things, such as completing the series of videos that I started last year, maybe trying out some lectures about music and history, as I mentioned before. And I'll continue my series on archaeological discoveries and historical artifacts. But most of all, I think outside of those ongoing series, I have been saying I want to start a series looking at the origins of the colonization of North America, and hence, in a sense, the origins of America as a country and a nation state. And I wanted to use this particular music for this series from Rameau's Les Indes Galantes, and maybe I'll explain more later where that piece comes from and how it fits into this picture. But I used it for this lecture to signal a kind of transition, especially since at this point it makes sense to discuss the idea of the nation and the sort of tropes of national history, because this is, in a sense, what I'm going to be doing in my series on early America, sort of trying to present a prehistory of the United States. And I hopefully will try to do so without making too many nationalist assumptions, right, about an essential national character, which a lot of American historians have tried to somehow distill out of American history, or an American national destiny, as if the emergence of the United States was somehow foreordained. But nonetheless, even if I do sort of avoid those assumptions, nonetheless, when you retrospectively construct a narrative that incorporates regions and peoples and events based on how they influenced the later formation of a state, you're unavoidably assuming a kind of teleology, a sort of destiny. And if you don't, then there is really no guiding principle or through line, and your narrative will just be disjointed and incoherent. So it's a very difficult balancing act, right, between buying into and then back projecting some political narrative justifying a national project, and on the other hand, falling into incoherence and chaos. Or even further, as some people I think do, constructing an anti-national counter-narrative, which is just as politically motivated, but kind of in the opposite direction. But regardless, to understand what I'm talking about, it is convenient to talk critically about this very idea of the nation, nationality, or nationhood, especially with respect to how it is shaped and driven our telling of history and our sense of the past. So, what is this lecture about then? What do I mean here? Well, since the 19th century, and especially since the 1970s, a whole lot of ink has been spilled over this question of nationhood and nationalism. Namely, why do people think of themselves as belonging to nations? What does that mean? And why are so many people so passionately committed, even to the point of being willing to die for their nation? So this whole question is multi-layered. It must necessarily involve meta-history, ideas or a history of ideas about history, right? Since the concept of the nation has always been inextricably intertwined with history and with time. So this is a subject I can't possibly cover comprehensively. It's a big one. It has a lot of layers to it. And so I expect this will be a long one, maybe kind of like my earlier one on conspiracy theories, which was number 20, another sort of round number. And I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to break this one up into 2 parts or just do it all in one go. We'll see. But I will try to discuss briefly, where did this idea of nations come from? How did it become a political force? And both of these are surprisingly mysterious and debated subjects, and how observers, including scholars, have, for one, tried to define what the nation is, 2, criticize the idea of nations and nationalism, and 3, tried to explain or account for the rise and power of this concept of the nation. And building on these points, I'll add a couple of brief observations of my own about why the idea of the nation and the nation-state persists as a basic framework of viewing the world, despite all of these problems and critiques, and why history continues to be so crucial and so linked to nationalism. Okay, so I'll start this off, I think, with a passage, specifically by reading the publisher's preface to an early edition of the book, A Popular History of Ireland by Thomas D'Arcy McGee. And this is a book that I encountered and started listening to as part of my preliminary research for a lecture I hope to do soon on Ireland as a kind of precondition for talking about the origins of America. So Thomas D'Arcy McGee, the author who wrote this book, was an Irish-Canadian politician. He'd been born in Ireland and was part of the revolutionary Republican group Young Ireland. He then fled to Canada, as many Irish revolutionaries fled abroad. He went to Canada and involved himself in Canadian politics while it was still a colony, a possession of Great Britain. And it seems he became more moderate in his politics. He disavowed Irish republicanism, became more favorable to the monarchy, and he transferred, it seems, his energies into the movement to create a Canadian confederation, an autonomous dominion of Canada. And so he's come to be called Canada's first nationalist. And his career, I think, illustrates how much nationalism was always really international. Since the 1800s, revolutionary nationalists have been constantly crossing borders, meeting up with fellow travelers and with their opposite numbers in other countries, lending support and borrowing rhetoric from one national movement to another. And you might recall in my earlier lectures on Italy how Giuseppe Garibaldi, the leading Italian revolutionary, fled abroad and joined the Uruguayan War of Independence in South America. And these sorts of networks, it seems, are so common. I recall a grad school classmate of mine describing to me how in the 1800s, nationalist revolutionaries from Armenia and other parts of the Ottoman Empire, many of whom were Freemasons, met up in lodges and cafes with Germans and Italians and formed sort of polyglot circles and cells of revolutionary nationalism. And in response, I observed how in that era there was a kind of nationalist international. And all in all, it seems as if once the idea of the nation, or of the nation as an organic body of people that is entitled to independence, is conceived, it then spreads like a contagion and could be passed quickly from one ethnic or linguistic group to the next ad infinitum. But anyway, with all of that in mind, to go back to our book. In 1863, when this book was published, McGee was in the Legislative Assembly of the province of Canada, and he published his book, A Popular History of Ireland, which it seems was the first work of Irish history for a broad reading public. And it seems it was indeed popular. It went through multiple editions, reprinted many times on both sides of the Atlantic from the 1860s through the 1880s. And since I'm planning to do a lecture on Ireland soon, I started reading the particular edition of the book that can be found online. And this is the one that was published in 1869 in Glasgow, Scotland, by the publishers Cameron and Ferguson, who it seems mainly printed books aimed at the Irish community in Scotland. And in their edition, Cameron and Ferguson added their own publisher's preface, which begins, quote, "Ireland, lifting herself from the dust, drying her tears, and proudly demanding her legitimate place among the nations of the earth, is a spectacle to cause immense progress in political philosophy. Behold a nation whose fame had spread over all the earth ere the flag of England had come into existence. For 500 years her life has been apparently extinguished. The fiercest whirlwind of oppression that ever in the wrath of God was poured upon the children of disobedience had swept over her. She was an object of scorn and contempt to her subjugator. Only at times were there any signs of life, an occasional meteor flash that told of her olden spirit, of her deathless race. The fullness of time has come, and with one gallant sunward bound the old land comes forth into the political day to teach these lessons, that right must always conquer might in the end, that by a compensating principle in the nature of things, repression creates slowly but certainly a force for its overthrow. Had it been possible to kill the Irish nation, it had long since ceased to exist. But the transmitted qualities of her glorious children, who were giants in intellect, virtue, and arms for 1,500 years before Alfred the Saxon sent the youth of his country to Ireland in search of knowledge with which to civilize his people, the legends, songs, and dim traditions of this glorious era, and the irrepressible piety, sparkling wit, and dauntless courage of her people, have at last brought her forth like Lazarus from the tomb. True, the garb of the prison or the cerements of the grave may be hanging upon her, but loose her hand and let her go is the wise policy of those in whose hands also are her present destinies. A nation with such strange history must have some great work yet to do in the world." End quote. So we're seeing here a narrative with Ireland as the main character, personified right off the bat as she, and at other times called a nation or a race. And the main theme of this narrative is immortality and resurrection. The Irish are called a deathless race and are directly likened to Lazarus, whom Christ raised from the dead in the New Testament. And this national person is described as having a glorious ancient past, but then was persecuted and oppressed, but could not be killed, but rather survived to rise to glory again in the present day. So an important and remarkable aspect of this narrative, which I'll point out here, is the non-specificity. There is no reference to any specific places, events, or persons other than only Alfred the Saxon, who is a foreigner, not an Irishman. If one took this passage and blanked out that name and the words England, Ireland, and Irish, then the whole passage could be referring to basically any nation in the world. And indeed, one could open up hundreds or thousands of national histories that have been printed over the past 200 years and see pretty much the same story told about some other nation, whether China or Serbia or Eritrea. It existed back in the mists of prehistory when we were strong and independent, virtuous and creative. In historical time, we emerged into a golden age in which we were envied and admired by the world. Then we were subjugated by foreign oppressors and suffered persecution, but we carried on our traditions and our collective self-awareness mainly through folk culture. We are just now emerging onto the world stage, ready to take our rightful place among the nations of the earth. So nationalist narratives in this way, you could say, are always told in an eternal present, with the reconstituted nation just on the brink of full resurrection and triumph. Okay, so why does this matter? What does this show? Well, for one thing, it shows the importance of Ireland as a paradigmatic romantic nationalist movement, which set the tone for many others. That is certainly true. But also it shows this transferability of the national story. And somehow over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, almost everyone came to see themselves as belonging to a nation in this sense. And everyone seemed to learn to write their own and tell their own national histories in this same basic mode. Even the British, who were the foremost imperial oppressors of the 19th century, ruling over a massive polyglot empire, including Ireland. And even their historians, even British historians and legal scholars, wrote about a pristine Anglo-Saxon liberty, which was violated by the Norman yoke imposed by foreign invaders, which then had to be thrown off in order to restore English liberty and unleash the power and talent of the nation. And indeed, the similarity between this British Anglo-Saxonist narrative and the Irish nationalist narrative put forth in Cameron and Ferguson's preface is uncanny. So it seems as if, broadly speaking, this mode of viewing the world through nations and national histories spread and took hold fairly quickly after 1800. Now, note some of the phrasing in Cameron and Ferguson's preface might sound a bit reminiscent also of the American Declaration of Independence, which lists the oppressions and degradations visited upon the American colonies by the tyrant George III. And specifically, Cameron and Ferguson describe Ireland as, quote, demanding her legitimate place among the nations of the earth, which seems to echo the opening of the American Declaration of Independence, which claims that these new states have the right to, quote, assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which they are entitled. But the change in wording here is very important. The American revolutionaries still saw the world as controlled by powers, meaning rulers, states, and empires. They don't assume the world to be composed of nations, or collective bodies of people that exist and perpetuate themselves through time, even when powerless and stateless. This is the most fundamental change here. And along with that, the Declaration of Independence makes no claim to a past history. It makes no reference to any ancient origins or root or founding, nor any past golden age that they seek to restore. Quite the opposite. It assumes that a new sovereign power is now being created and called into being, basically out of nothing, ex nihilo, on a specific date by a specific group of people in a room in Philadelphia by means of signing and promulgating this document. And the delegates who signed it represented certain existing states, but there was no pre-existing nation, and nothing like the Ireland or Irish nation that Ferguson and Cameron assume already exists and stretches back into the mists of time. So this preface to McGee's book, when I read it, it seemed to me to encapsulate a way of viewing the world that took hold after 1800 and really was not normal or common before then. And I will try to discuss a bit this idea of the nation, not just as a political or social concept, broadly speaking, but more specifically as a historical myth, a way of explaining the world in terms of narrative. So where did this come from and how did this change come about? Well, I'll try to touch in this lecture on, firstly, the basic narrative of the emergence and history of the nation as a phenomenon, its precursors and forerunners, the emergence of the concept and category from the Middle Ages through the 18th century, culminating in the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and then the rise of nationalism, which can be defined roughly as the idea that the state should correspond to the nation, or as national identity and loyalty as a political force, and how this spread from Europe then to the rest of the world, including Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And then I'll try to briefly outline the meta-history of the nation, the critical analysis of this idea, how scholars have tried to define the nation, and how the failure of those efforts led to an increasing skepticism and towards scholarly deconstruction of the concept of the nation. And then the scholarly quest to explain or account for the rise of nations and nationalism. And finally, I'll give a small defense of the scholarly critique of the nation, including my own observations on why nationalism and national myths persist, despite all of these criticisms and critiques. Okay, so firstly, where were we before the nation, or who were we? Well, there are many long-standing common ideas of small groupings, right? Villages, clans, and tribes, which are usually understood to share a common language and customs, a shared ancestry, and perhaps a shared mythic ancestor, some common protective deities, and some territory, however vaguely defined. And these sort of basic communities have been held together by personal, face-to-face ties and acquaintances and ties of kinship. Now, above this basic village or tribal grouping, there have been different larger scale forms of organization, going back into ancient civilizations. So this includes, for one thing, city-states, like one would see in Greece or Morea, India, or Mayan Mexico. So these are larger than just the tribe or village, but they still tend to have shared customs and language. They lack the personal face-to-face acquaintance of the tribe or village, right? They're in a larger city, they're bound to be people you don't know personally, and therefore they must maintain cohesion through intentional strategies that cultivate a sense of fictive kinship, such as elaborate public festivals and ceremonies paying homage to a shared ancestor or shared deity, the glorification of a ruler as a shared symbol of the city, and a literature for maintaining a shared language and mythology. But these are still very different from what we would call a nation. They often shared the same language and customs as other neighboring city-states, and even recognized a kind of extended kinship with them too, but did not believe that therefore they should all belong to the same state, or have the same rulers, or laws, or institutions. So one could say in this sense, ethnicity, what we would call ethnicity, right? The sense of an extended kinship with a common language. Ethnicity was separate from politics. People recognized broader groupings based on shared traits like language or ancestry, but did not see these shared traits as necessarily connecting them politically. Now, a good example, or one that we know more about, is Greece. So in Greece, before the Macedonian conquest and the rise of Alexander, Greece comprised many polises, basically what we call city-states. Citizens of one polis usually saw those of another polis as foreigners, but not as foreign as the non-Greek speakers, whom they called barbarians. So they generally recognized that all Greeks or Hellenes shared a common language and certain familiar customs, which set them apart from the barbarians. And also some, like Plato, who was kind of obsessed with eugenics, Plato said that all Hellenes belonged to one ancestral stock, or genos, right? So this is a word coming from animal husbandry. They're all a sort of similar breed. Also, Herodotus, in his history, he discussed the commonalities between Athenians and Spartans, even though they were mortal enemies. And Herodotus wrote, "Then there is our common Greekness. We are all one in blood and one in language. Those shrines of the gods belong to us in common, and the sacrifices in common. And there are our habits, bred of a common upbringing." End quote. And his word for Greekness here is Ellenikotita. Right? There's some sort of shared quality that defines Hellenes, and hence they were all part of one ethnos, which seems to be a broad word for something, right? Something close to what we now call ethnicity, right? Deriving from this Greek word ethnos. But nonetheless, these Hellenes did not have any illusion that therefore they were naturally or organically united or could compose a single unified political community. And in fact, the cities of Greece spent just as much time fighting each other as not. Other peoples, it seems, also had some similar words with similar meanings to ethnos, meaning something like an ancestrally related people broader than just the tribe. For instance, the ancient Jews or Israelites. Now, you may know there are biblical passages in the Hebrew Bible that refer to nations, or some word that we translate into English as nations, such as in Isaiah, when the prophet says that Israel will be, quote, a light unto the nations. Well, the actual Hebrew word that's being translated here is goy in the singular, or goyim, plural. And it seems to have had a broad meaning, something like people or nation, similar to the Greek ethnos or genos. It's unclear what the relationship was of this goy grouping to power or rulership or the state, but evidently it refers to a collective that in some way exists apart from the king or the ruler. Now, importantly, in Exodus 19, we're told that the Israelites are journeying through the desert, the Sinai region. At this point, they have no ruler, but they are led by Moses as a prophet and lawgiver. They encamp by Mount Sinai. Moses ascends the mountain and receives a message from God. And this message says, in part, quote, Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. So this phrase at the end there in Hebrew is Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. So there will be two things. The Israelites will be two things. For one, Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, right? And Mamelech, that word for kingdom, contains the word Melech, Lord, ruler. And then secondly, they will be Goy Kadosh, a holy people or tribe or nation. Now it's unclear what is the relationship here. Are these two things distinct? They must be to some degree, right? Kingdom and nation, because there are two different words for them. But are they linked? And if so, how? Does one beget the other? Does a kingdom define a people or a nation, or does a nation constitute a kingdom? There's a sort of chicken and egg problem. Does the kingdom come first and create the nation, or does the nation come first? But regardless, whichever way this runs, and maybe there was no clear accepted idea here, nonetheless, there are some important traits here implied by the application of the word goy to the Israelites. For one thing, it is somehow distinct from rulership and the state. It is instantiated in the people themselves and their shared devotion to a single deity. That, the nation is a nation of priests. It is consecrated and dedicated to this God. It is broader and more inclusive than just the tribe, because we know there were many tribes among the Israelites, according to this biblical narrative. And further, it is broadly applicable. While the Israelites are special, they are a Goy Kadosh, a holy nation, they are not the only Goy, and they can be compared to other Goyim, as seen as we saw in the book of Isaiah. And this seems to confirm, the Israelites will be a light unto the nations, right? There are other nations out there that have some sort of relationship with the Jews or the Israelites. And this seems to confirm what I remember the scholar Daniel Boyarin saying in his lectures about the origins of Judaism, that Jews in this era were a different species, you could say, but not a different genus. Right? They belonged to a type of grouping that had parallels and peers in the world. Now, for many listeners, this might sound very strange and ironic to hear me referring to the Jews or the Israelites as a goy, since that word today has been adopted into Yiddish and to some degree into English as a rather impolite word for a non-Jew. So, how did that happen? Well, it seems at first the word simply meant nation in a neutral sense. Then it was applied to mean foreign nations, right? The non-Jews who live abroad outside the Israelite kingdom, such as in the descriptions of Solomon's temple, where the first forecourt was called the court of the Gentiles or the nations, or in Hebrew, the Goyim. And today, the more neutral or politically correct term for a non-Jew is Gentile. Now, interestingly, that word Gentile actually comes from a Latin root, the word gens, which it seems was related in some way to the Greek term genos, both of them coming from an older Indo-European root meaning to beget. And this word gens was used in the Roman world to mean family or clan or tribe or some sort of kin group that used the same name. It also was sometimes used more broadly to larger groups that have a shared language and some sort of idea of shared kinship. And in this way, it could be more similar to the Greek ethnos. And so this is a typical case, one of many cases where a Latin word has to be stretched to cover a broader semantic terrain, because Latin has fewer words in it than Greek does. So a Latin word had to be applied more broadly to a wider range of semantic terrain, which in Greek would be divided up among several more specific words. But as we see, there are all of these sort of broad terms for groupings of people: ethnos, goy, and gens. All of them, it seems, refer to some association of people with shared traits, such as language, customs, or ancestry. All imply some kind of real or fictive kinship. All are defined in contradistinction to someone else, right? Foreigners, Gentiles, barbarians, strangers. None of them implies having a shared ruler or kingdom or state. None of them necessarily imply the right to sovereignty or self-rule or anything like we would call statehood, even if these ancient people even had such a concept. And power, it seems, was organized in the ancient world into totally different units. Above and beyond the city-state, there were kingdoms and empires. So let's talk about kingdoms and empires. These were held together by a shared loyalty to a ruler or a ruling body, like the Roman Senate. They might be based around a dominant ethnos or tribe that established power over their neighbors, or not. It could be either way. If it started out that way, with one tribe or ethnic group conquering and dominating its neighbors, then these might soon blend together and assimilate. And these kingdoms and empires were very often polyglot or multi-ethnic in today's words. The anchor of authority was the ruler or ruling council. They usually did have a shared imperial language of learning and of administration, like Greek in the Hellenistic empires, Sanskrit in the Maurya Empire, Mandarin in China, and Latin, of course, in the Roman Empire. But beyond that, the everyday language spoken by most of the people really didn't matter and was not especially a concern of the state. Kingdoms and empires expanded as they gained the submission and loyalty of more people. They were not in any way limited to people of a certain ancestry or ethnicity. And empires specifically were understood to represent civilization itself, which by definition could not be limited. So it seems the great ideal of ancient rulers was universal empire, or a single, all-embracing authority which represents law, order, and civilization, and which ought to include all people throughout the world. Hence, empires did not make many maps of their territory. That was really only a military thing, which might be needed when pacifying some barbarians on the outer frontiers of the empire. Rather, empires and rulers generally did not think of themselves as being limited or contained by borders or by anything else. Hence, this is why it was such an unusual and surprising action when the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a wall across northern Britain to hold off the barbarians. It was very unusual for an emperor to acknowledge some sort of fixed boundary. And previously, the Romans had just claimed rule over all of Britain, regardless of whether they could really effectively enforce it in the north or not. Now, a great irony here about the Romans that I would draw out of this is that the Romans really didn't think all that often about the Roman Empire, at least not in the sense that we do today. They did not think about it as an expanse of territory governed by law and military force that had borders and a distinct rise and fall in time. For them, the Roman authority was much more conceptual. We refer to the Roman Empire, and sometimes it's said, well, that's a translation of the ancient phrase Imperium Romanum. But that's not quite true. Imperium Romanum meant something more like Roman authority, which in principle spread over most of the known world and represented Rome's place as the universal guarantor of peace. And this phrase Pax Romana, we often invoke it as referring to a time period, right? There was this golden age, right? We think of it in national terms. There was this golden age that rose and fell in a specific period of time. That is not what Pax Romana meant in the Roman age. It did not refer to a period, but rather to a condition of life, basically representing law and order and civilization, like how we today refer to the rule of law or the civilized world or democracy, etc. Now, the Romans, to be clear, they did care about Rome as the center of the world and about Romanitas, the condition or quality of being Roman, but not as an ethnic or ancestral quality, but rather as a matter of customs, habits, and worldview, such as speaking Latin and being part of this universal civilization centering on Rome. And one can see this as basically similar to China in the same era and even after, right? So China was called Zhonghua, the Middle Kingdom, not because it was between heaven and hell, not in a metaphysical sense, but because it was at the center of the world, and everything revolved in that way around China. And certain Chinese customs, such as language, dress, hygiene, sex, and most of all, adherence to Confucian teachings, these were taken to represent civilization itself. And anyone, in principle, could become part of this civilization if they assimilated into it. It was common for Chinese officials and writers to refer to barbarians who lived beyond the bounds of Chinese civilization and to place them along a sliding scale of raw and cooked. They were using this cooking metaphor, and the more foreign and uncivilized barbarians were seen as more raw. Those who were relatively more assimilated were more cooked, and by implication, more ready to be consumed, digested, and absorbed into the body of the empire. So one can see here an almost total disconnect between these sort of super tribal ethnic groupings that we've been talking about, like gens or ethnos on the one hand, and political authority on the other, which depended on this ideal of civilization, law and order, which was universal and all-embracing. So when did this situation start to change? It started to change in the Middle Ages, where this idea of the ethnos, the gens, the people, started to be drawn closer and to be linked more closely to rulership. So in the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire and in the rise of new universalistic religions like Christianity and Islam, the whole sort of terrain of politics changed. Medieval political forms, with the breakup of the Roman Empire, their authority was radically localized. And tribal groups were able now to set up new regional kingdoms, such as the Franks in Gaul, or what became France, the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, and later also the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, which gave rise to England. Now, this leads then to a peculiar sort of layered civilization, where the main political unit is the kingdom. And kingdoms are more regionally contained and coherent. Often they have sort of natural boundaries in seacoasts, rivers, mountain ranges, and their rulers are not understood to be universal, but rather they belong to dynasties associated with a specific tribe. Again, like the Carolingians are Franks. A common political doctrine takes shape which holds that a kingdom must have 4 basic elements: a ruler, a people, a country, and a body of laws. And this now connects rulership in some way to a distinct people, even if this is just an ideal, right? And kingdoms, in fact, were very polyglot and heterogeneous, and peoples were very mobile. Nonetheless, the concept changes, and the ruler is somehow connected to a distinct group of people in a distinct country. And the subjects are seen as somehow linked to this common ruler, who is in turn related to them. And in fact, our word king comes from a Germanic root, like the German König, which means kinsman, member of the family. Now, some more successful rulers in the Middle Ages also did build up larger, extensive dynastic realms, like the Holy Roman Empire or the Angevin Empire, but these were somewhat unusual. And what is more, layered over top of these kingdoms and dynastic realms, there was a broader, extensive religious community. And most importantly, these religious communities of the medieval and post-classical world include Western Christendom or Latin Christendom, Eastern Christendom, and Islam. So each one of these was self-conscious. People referred to themselves as living in and belonging to Christendom or to the Islamic Ummah, the Islamic community, or the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. And these were defined by shared religious doctrines and practices and by a shared sacred language, Latin, Greek, or Arabic. And this was the language of learning and philosophy, even for secular rulers and officials. And each of these sacred languages is held to have special access to truth over and above the local vernacular languages and dialects. Now, these communities, in fact, did have limits and boundaries, and they had external enemies. A lot of them were, fighting and contending with each other a lot of the time. But each one still aspired to be unlimited and universal, and in a way could be seen to inherit the ideal of universal empire or imperium from ancient Rome. And so all of these in different ways claim to be successors of Rome. Now, these religious communities understood history and time providentially, and this is a little hard to explain. It's very metaphysical. But they viewed all events in the world as in some way following a grand narrative, which could be understood through prophecy. And events in the past, present, and future are linked across space and time by shared meanings. right? So an event in the world that somehow echoes an event in the Bible, or a biblical event like Jesus, Mary, and Joseph's flight into Egypt, which, echoes the older event in the Old Testament of Joseph fleeing to Egypt. These things were directly linked by their shared meanings. But as for ordinary people in their everyday lives, they may occasionally think of themselves as belonging to these larger groupings, like the kingdom, like maybe when they hear a royal proclamation read or when they take a suit into court, or as part of the religious community, such as when they make a donation to fund the building of a cathedral, or in the later Middle Ages to the outfitting of a crusade. But by and large, for the most part, people in the pre-modern world saw themselves as fitting into interlocking social webs, defined by personal bonds to peers, superiors, and subordinates, extending from their own household to the manor, the parish, the town, and beyond. So people identified themselves by these personal ties and loyalties to clan or family, village or commune, or to their local lord, or to a religious order or guild. And power was exercised mainly through direct, face-to-face relationships and overwhelmingly orally in everyday spoken languages. So these are languages that vary tremendously from one town or village to the next and are often incomprehensible as one journeys a few miles down the road. So hence the everyday exercise of power was really only possible among people within a small local community with a shared language. And you can see in the early printed works of Caxton, the first printer who set up the first printing press in England in the 1400s, he reported an anecdote that's now very famous of men who were traveling from Sheffield in northern England, were intending to sail overseas to the continent, but were stranded in Kent in southern England and went up to a tavern and tried to order eggs, but were told by the tavern keeper, "I'm sorry, I don't speak French." So people from just different parts of the same country or kingdom could fail to understand each other and assume that they were foreigners. Now, meanwhile, more formal proceedings of law and administration were carried out in these classical or sacred languages, like Latin or Greek, that for the most part the ordinary people didn't know and didn't understand. So that whole wider world was literally foreign to them. Now, it seems these are basically the common conditions of most people's lives in the world before 1600 or so. Now, I've been talking here about Europe, but historians, sociologists have basically described this way of operating, this type of society, as pre-modern, and have argued that most of the world actually was pre-modern until very recently, until the 19th or 20th centuries. And under these sort of pre-modern conditions, it is impossible or really absurd for a person to try to think of themselves as belonging to some unified or uniform grouping of people, speaking one language or having one single ancestry, which can somehow govern itself as a collective organism. This was just inconceivable for most of history. So what changed? What made nationhood and nationalism possible? Well, this is very much debated, but major factors that scholars point to include, firstly, the printing revolution. So printers in the 14 and 1500s produced most of the canon of major works in Latin, and they eventually saturated the market of Latin speakers. And in order to keep making money, they had to branch out, and they began to transition to printing books in vernacular languages. And these might include translations of the old classics into some vernacular form of Italian or French or German, or collections of folklore or other new compositions. And this, it seems, began a self-reinforcing cycle, where printers sought out the most widely known, widespread dialects or varieties of the given languages, such as Tuscan in northern Italy, or Castilian in Spain, or the langue d'oil, the sort of northern form of French. And as books were produced in these sort of most widely known and circulated dialects, then more people began to learn to read, and they began to learn those dialects. And gradually they emerged as the standard forms of the languages of the respective countries or kingdoms: Italy, Spain, France, Germany, England. And this had several results then. The vernacular languages started to gradually displace Latin. Learned treatises were now written in the vernacular. And also, the Protestant Reformation took place, which was very important in religion and politics, and also is a crucial part of the history of language. So the Protestant Reformation put forward new theological ideas, emphasizing Scripture alone as the basic source of authority and religious truth. And Luther was the first theologian to gain a public audience through print. And also the Scriptures themselves were then translated into the vernacular languages, beginning again with Luther, who went through the arduous process of translating the Bible into German. So as these languages then took hold and became the lingua franca of sort of growing national reading publics, or I shouldn't use that word yet, but broad reading publics, the states and rulers began to see these vernacular languages as useful for governance. Some of them started using the languages in communication and correspondence, in law courts, and eventually in schools. But this was very uneven. In some places like the Holy Roman Empire and then the Austrian Empire, they were so polyglot that the language of administration continued to be Latin. But other countries were quicker to switch over. Some of you may know the King Richard III, as early as the 1480s, had the laws of England translated from Latin into English. Now, some other states, especially France, were different, and the course was long and complicated. Because in France, there were regional languages and dialects, especially in the south, but there is also a dominant dialect in the north. And so it seemed feasible to expose everyone throughout the kingdom to that main dialect that one heard around Paris, and to try to create a monolingual state. This would then make it easier to communicate with the populace and to surveil and tax the whole country. And so it was a great instrument of social control and management. In 1635, the French crown founded the Académie Française to define and standardize French. And by the 1700s, France had an active civil society and press, all in a standard shared national language. And France was not the most literate or educated society in Europe, but at least on the level of the reading literate public, France became the most linguistically integrated. There was a clear divide between people who had been initiated into this broadly read, broadly spoken French, and those who still lived in small regional spheres with their own languages and dialects, like Languedoc or Breton or Provençal. Now, around this time, by the 1740s or so, broad groupings who perhaps spoke a similar language came to be referred to as nations. Although the usage of this term seems to be very uneven and uncertain. It's unclear whether it refers to a small tribe or clan or a broader group united by a native language, or the people of a kingdom who have a common language of print, like in England or France. So it's still a very loose and broad and variable term. But this word nation, to see how it came forward, it comes originally from a Latin root, from natio, which initially just means birth, but can more broadly mean birth, origin, breed, stock, kind, species, race of people, or tribe. And because it comes from that basic root, as we saw, of birth, it implies some sort of shared ancestry, or at least a group into which one is born. Right? It is not a voluntary association. It is defined by birth. So this was a word circulating in Latin in the Middle Ages. And in the 12th century, students and scholars were congregating in particular cities in order to study the classics and also particular disciplines, such as in Bologna to study law or in Paris for theology. I talked about this in my history of universities. And these students who came from far and wide into these cities like Bologna and Paris, they were often ostracized, discriminated against, or preyed upon because they were foreigners and not citizens of those cities. So over the course of the 1100s, they began to associate together into social clubs or guilds based on a shared vernacular language. So they all studied Latin and, used it in the classroom. But outside the classroom, they wished to socialize in their native tongues. And the associations they formed were called nations, or natio. And in some cities, like in Paris, they further joined together to help found the university. So the University of Paris had constituent nations, or natios, for French, Normans, Picards, English, and Germans. And the word natio then passed into French as nation, meaning, it seems, birth, rank, descendants, relatives, country, or homeland. So you can see here the idea of the nation emerges initially from the encounter of students in the university towns with their peers from faraway lands who speak different languages and have different customs. And this origin shows how the very idea of the nation involves defining a group identity based on differences from someone else. Right? So a bunch of Germans walking around in Germany were not saying we're part of a nation, or English people going to Oxford didn't say we're a nation. But when they went abroad to a foreign place where they were seen as strange and alien and had to defend themselves, then they associate together based on these shared traits, and they adopt this word of nation. And indeed, it seems that students and their nations in the Middle Ages were foremost experts in regional and ethnic stereotyping. For example, in the 1200s, a French scholar named Jacques de Vitry studied at Paris, and he later wrote about his time at Paris that the students believed that, quote, "The English were drunkards and had tails, the sons of France proud, effeminate, and carefully adorned like women. They said that the Germans were furious and obscene at their feasts, the Normans vain and boastful, the Poitevins traitors and always adventurers. The Burgundians they considered vulgar and stupid. The Bretons were reputed to be fickle and changeable, and were often reproached for the death of Arthur. The Lombards were called avaricious, vicious, and cowardly, the Romans seditious, turbulent, and slanderous, the Sicilians tyrannical and cruel, the inhabitants of Brabant men of blood, incendiaries, brigands, and ravishers, the Flemish fickle, prodigal, gluttonous, yielding as butter, and slothful. After such insults from words, they often came to blows." End quote. Now, some things that might strike a modern reader about this passage from Vitry. First of all of these stereotypes are 100% accurate. Secondly, the list includes a lot of groups that we would not today call nations. A lot of them we would just think of, if we've heard of them at all, would think of them simply as subnational ethnic groupings, like Bretons, Poitevins, and Burgundians. All of these would today be considered part of France and their inhabitants French. But this is because after 1600, the French state went to great pains to discourage their local dialects and identities and to redefine them all as French. Also, you might notice Sicilians. Many of us have heard of Sicily and Sicilians. And Sicily went through a sort of similar process, but much later, under the Italian national state, which inculcated standard Italian, but never entirely successfully. And a lot of these distinct regional identities are still very much persistent in Italy, even more so than in France. But these questions still linger about a lot of these subnational groups. What if their local languages and dialects do survive? And what if people in these regions still conceive of themselves as a distinct group within the nation or even outside the nation? Do they then have some kind of group right to independence, and who decides? Now, regardless, all of this really still remains unresolved in the air. But regardless of all that, the word nation, it seems, passed from French into English and became nation in English around 1300. Meaning basically, quote, a race of people or large group with common ancestry and language. By about 1750, talk of nations was common in Europe. It's all over the press, probably the most frequent and familiar in France, but also in Britain. And if one looks into Google Ngrams at the frequency of the occurrence of the word nation in print in English, there's a period of extremely frequent use of the word lasting about from the 1740s through the 1830s, after which it diminishes somewhat but is still common. So it seems you can say this maybe was when the idea of the nation was most fresh, most live, most relevant to current philosophical debate in Britain and in Europe. And it was in the middle, right in the middle of this period, that we see the French Revolution. So in this revolution, of course, the authority of the French crown was called into question. And in the late summer of 1792, the king and the royal family were imprisoned as suspected traitors. The revolution also then provoked an invasion by a coalition of German states, including Austria and Prussia. And in response to this, the French National Convention, which had seized power in place of the king, the convention declared a levée en masse, mobilizing every man, woman, and child and every resource in the country for the war. And in doing so, they could not make the traditional appeal to loyalty to the king, which is the sort of thing you would previously do when you wanted to, muster people up and send them to war. So instead, they appealed to the defense of the homeland, or the patrie. And the French army was outnumbered by their opponents from Germany, but they were bolstered nonetheless by new recruits who were fired with a new passion, and they marched to the battlefield singing new patriotic revolutionary anthems like La Marseillaise, and they managed to repulse the Germans, at least for a time, at the Battle of Valmy in September 1792. And reportedly the French troops showed exceptional zeal, chanting slogans like Vive la Nation. So instead of Vive le Roi, long live the king, they now heard Vive la Nation, long live the nation. And historians have pointed to this as possibly the origin moment of nationalism as we today understand it. And just the following day after Valmy, the National Convention abolished the monarchy. And subsequently, the French were able to win the war and further to turn the tables by invading Austrian territory in Belgium. And this began a long-term campaign in which the French armies invaded and conquered most of West and Central Europe under the Revolutionary Republic and then after under Napoleon. So the French Revolution revealed certain important things. It showed the tremendous power of appeal to national patriotic feeling and mass mobilization. But it also uncovered the great unevenness in this new national identity. So the greatest fervor for the revolution was in the cities, especially Paris and Marseille. Among the urban working and middle classes, there was more skepticism in the countryside. And there also was a regional difference, where there was stronger enthusiasm for the revolution and the war in eastern France and much weaker in western France. And the revolution and the new nationalism were rejected in the west-central coast. And a particular area called the Vendée on the Atlantic coast became the site of a massive, bloody, counter-revolutionary uprising, touched off by the state's attacks on the church and by military conscription for the war, which the people resisted. Another major hotbed of counter-revolutionary fervor and resistance was in Brittany, just north of the Vendée. So that's the province in the far northwest of France, which still largely spoke the Celtic language Breton, and which had distinct regional customs and a strong local identity that did not sit easily with this new national frenzy for France, for la nation, la patrie. So the new national consciousness was very uneven, and the project of national mobilization was incomplete. Nonetheless, this had reverberating effects. The revolution, the levée en masse, the invasions of Europe. These invasions of neighboring countries like Italy and Spain caused revolutionary networks to then adopt certain French ideas and turn them to their own ends, and in some cases to turn them back against France. There was an ironic reversal where people rallied to the defense of Italy or Spain as their own nations, their own homelands, as against these French invaders. And this reversal was most important and most impactful in Germany. So let's talk about national consciousness in Germany. So France repeatedly invaded and raided Western Germany from the late 1790s through 1806, at which time the Holy Roman Empire formally abolished itself in order to avoid the imperial throne falling into the hands of Napoleon. And this caused a great sense of humiliation among the various German states. So these German states no longer even had a confederation to rally or coordinate their resistance to the French. And this caused a great deal of consternation among German intellectuals. And the rising and fashionable intellectual school at this time was called idealism, right? You'll hear of German idealism. And, it's a metaphysical thing, but basically idealists believe in the primacy of thought and consciousness over the physical or the body. And these idealists see a lot to admire in the French Revolution. They like the high ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but they also argue then that France has betrayed these same ideals and that therefore they must be adopted, perfected, and realized in Germany instead. And most prominently of these German idealists, Johann Fichte, he delivers a series of lectures in 1807 and 1808, so just after the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved. And these lectures are then printed in a book called Addresses to the German Nation. And the book calls on Germans to unite and argues that it is the destiny of Germany as a sort of country or collective entity. It's the destiny of Germany to, quote, found an empire of spirit and reason and to annihilate completely the crude physical force that rules the world. You can imagine in his view that crude physical force is represented by France and the French armies tromping through Germany. So you can note here also the idealism, right? This belief in mind over matter, spirit over physical force. And the word that Fichte uses for spirit is Geist, which, it's commonly translated as spirit in English. It can also mean something like mind, consciousness, or awareness. And Fichte argues that Germans have a unique Geist that sets them apart as spiritual leaders of humankind. And this view is then adopted by many other German idealists, and Fichte's argument is combined with those of an older philosopher from just a few years earlier, Johann Gottfried von Herder, who had died in 1803. And Herder had studied the German language and argued that it should be embraced and taken seriously as a language of learning and philosophy in place of Latin. Right? So this is formally proclaiming this kind of overthrow of Latin by the vernacular. And further, Herder actually studied German folklore and folk customs, the sort of things that scholars would have turned their noses up at in prior centuries. But he studies German folklore and customs and argues that the true essence of Germany was found among the folk, which he portrays as an organic, unified people joined by common beliefs, customs, and ancestry, which then transcends region and class. And he wrote, quote, "There is only one class in the state, the folk, not the rabble, and the king belongs to this class as well as the peasant," end quote. So important things to note here about these ideas put forward by Herder and Fichte. They offer a basis for German unity and resistance to foreign domination apart from loyalty to any king or emperor, right? You don't need the Holy Roman Empire. You have the people, the folk, and the king is just one of the folk. And basically you could say this unity of the state and the folk is in fact the nation, right? You could say, although it's anachronistic, they're sort of proposing Germany as a nation state. So historians and philosophers will sometimes say that nationalism is unusual among all political ideologies in the sense that it has no great founding or defining theorist, like Locke, you could say, for liberalism, or Marx for communism. And this is true to a degree. Nationalism, it seems, arose gradually among the broader reading public, right? It was never the stated theory of one, towering intellectual figure. But Herder and Fichte were influential, right? They're not towering figures today. They're not widely read like Marx or Locke, but they were influential in their time in defining German nationalism and articulating it in a very abstract form that was fairly transportable. And Herder himself even argued that everyone ought to strive to fulfill the ideals of their own nation, each of which was unique and distinct. And he wrote, quote, "Every nation bears in itself the standard of its perfection, totally independent of all comparison with that of others," end quote. So you can see this as a kind of, cultural relativism avant la lettre, right? But importantly, he's assuming everyone belongs to a nation. And German romantic and idealistic nationalism became a template and inspiration for others, including especially the Greeks and the Ottoman Empire, who have a very long, deep history going back into ancient times. And the Greeks in the Ottoman state could draw on historical figures and symbols, including pre-Christian ones like Plato and Aristotle and Demosthenes, whom most Greek peasants had barely heard of, but they could then adopt them as national forebears. And young Greeks in the early 1800s began to identify themselves more by language and supposed ancestry rather than by religion, which had been normal, right? In the Ottoman Empire, you were Greek if you belonged to the Greek Orthodox Church. But this sort of shift in identity and in meaning, what it meant to be Greek, this paved the way then for the Greek Revolution and Greek independence. And this was followed then by other Christian groups in the Ottoman Empire, such as Serbs, Bulgars, Armenians, and also later by Arabs. And finally, in the 1840s, German-style romantic nationalism was rapidly taken up and asserted by minority ethno-linguistic groups that were ruled over by the German-speaking Habsburg Empire, such as Hungarians, Czechs, and Poles, and later also Jews. One can see Zionism as falling in this same line, right? The Jews of the Austro-Hungarian Empire are a nation and they deserve a state, just the same as the Hungarians and the Czechs. Also, Mazzini in Italy became the main spokesman and ringleader of this emerging nationalist international, uniting various revolutionaries with the Italian unification movement, which was then sort of seen as the new model and cause célèbre. So the spread of this new nationalism is demonstrated, for one thing, in the 1848 revolutions, which was called the springtime of the nations. And although 1848 ultimately failed, nonetheless national movements continued to grow and spread, including in Ireland, which became perhaps the most powerful and paradigmatic case of romantic nationalism in the world, right? A country that was technically integrated into the United Kingdom, but which sought to break away from it and reassert an ancient nationhood and independence, and did so in English, right, in what was becoming the most widely read international vernacular. Then, in another ironic reversal, after the 1850s, nationalism was also cultivated and harnessed by established European states and empires, right? So it wasn't just a revolutionary resistance movement, it became an official ideology in several important states, such as in Prussia, which engineered German unification in the 1870s, in Russia, which adopted and promoted both Russian and pan-Slavic nationalism as a way to oppose Germany and Austria, and in Victorian Britain, which adopted and promoted a British nationalism based in shared commitment to Protestantism, the Empire, and increasingly Anglo-Saxonism. So really the only major power here in Europe that didn't do this was Austria-Hungary, arguably because that state was too polyglot and multi-ethnic, and nationalism would always necessarily be a centrifugal and not a uniting force in Austria-Hungary. Now, in this general era in the later 19th century, scholars often will say that nationalism moved from left to right. So nationalism became more and more dissociated from democratic republicanism and linked more and more instead to authoritarian parties and movements. And nationalist propagandists started to give up on advocacy for religious toleration and more pluralist ideas of the nation, and instead adopted more social Darwinism, intolerance towards minorities, and anti-Semitism in particular. And the Dreyfus Affair in France in the 1890s became the great flashpoint of these conflicting ideas of nationalism. So this basic idea that nationalism moved from left to right, you could say it has some basic validity, but perhaps it can also be a bit distorting. I would ask, did nationalism itself and the idea of the nation really change all that much? Nationalism was always militaristic, right back to the French Revolution, and early theorists of the nation actually also showed a degree of bigotry and intolerance in their unpublished writings. For instance, the Abbé Sieyès, who was an early agitator for the French Revolution, and who argued that the Third Estate, the common people, represented the whole nation, he also dabbled in eugenics, and in some of his letters advocated the idea of crossbreeding humans and apes to create an easily controlled slave race. And also Herder, whom we talked about before, that German romantic nationalist. In his letters, he expressed anti-Semitism and presented Jews as a threatening alien nation within the nation. So these are views that would not have sounded so out of place in the late 1800s when eugenics and ethno-nationalism were all the rage. But these early theorists just kept more quiet about them because I think the situation was different. Nationalists always in some way have to define the people as against some alien enemy or oppressor that threatens the organic unity and purity of the nation. And for early revolutionary nationalists, that was a class or an institution that was parasitic upon the nation, like the aristocracy or the Catholic Church. Whereas later, after some social transformation had been achieved, for instance, the Ancien Regime had been overthrown in France and replaced with a republic, or in Germany, the princely states had been merged into a unified German state, then the enemy had to change, and it became instead some internal group defined by language or religion or blood, and a very common target, of course, was the Jews. And perhaps I'm being a bit too functionalist here, but I think it is worth asking whether or not there is really an internal logic in nationalism that forms a common thread here, right from the 18th century and the French Revolution through to the end of the 19th century, and linking the more liberal, inclusive, and democratic Republican nationalism of the Romantic era with the more racist and authoritarian nationalism of the Victorian age. But regardless, that's ambiguous, open to debate. But this whole shift eventually comes to a head in World War I, when nationalism serves to mobilize the major states for total war. It really ends up being enshrined, especially in the memorialization of the large numbers of war dead. So when still today sees important national patriotic symbols like the poppy in Great Britain that are rooted in the mourning for the dead of World War I. And as political scientists have pointed out very aptly, the war began the custom of the tomb of the unknown soldier. So this is a monument and a set of rituals that I was exposed to growing up in the United States, where there's a tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. But I didn't realize at that time that it's actually common all over Europe as well. And states in the aftermath of the war began to build grandiose monuments to house the remains of some soldiers who had perished on the battlefield and could not be identified. And they are often guarded and surrounded by elaborate ceremony and rituals. And this can be seen on one level as simply a way of paying homage to soldiers that could not be memorialized by family. But there were already many ways to do this, such as simply by giving the dead a decent burial and a grave marked as unidentified soldier. And the fact that in World War I, states began to gather together these unidentified remains into a massive monumental tomb surrounded by pomp and circumstance suggests that in some way the value of these soldiers' lives was actually elevated, not only by their death and sacrifice, but even more so by their loss of their individual identity, which then allows them to be subsumed into the undifferentiated mass of the nation. So this practice, one could say, seems to celebrate this stripping of individuality to merge into the collective. The national ideal comes out of the war stronger than ever and is really enshrined as the guiding spirit of the new post-World War I era. Many new states were created out of the downfall of large European empires, especially the Habsburg Empire, but also the Russian and German empires. The Ottoman Empire was finally overthrown in the 1920s and replaced with the Turkish national state. And these new states tended to adopt new national mythologies and to present themselves as nation-states, with national founding figures and languages and schools teaching a national history, etc. And President Wilson of the United States made self-determination a watchword of the peace talks in 1919, and he proposed that the peace thereafter should be maintained by a so-called League of Nations, basically assuming what Herder had assumed more than 100 years earlier, basically that all people do belong to some nation or other, each of which constitutes a unified, singular thinking and acting self, as in this phrase, self-determination. And these selves then ought to relate to one another as independent thinking and acting entities. Now, Europeans ironically embraced this model and idea more readily than the Americans themselves did. It seemed like a reasonable enough way to manage affairs and maintain peace in Europe, and it was a convenient rationale to break up the German and Austrian empires that had lost the war, so long as this model of nationhood was not applied abroad, in the sections of the world like Asia and Africa that the European powers had colonized. So until the 1930s, the League of Nations had only 6 member states in all of Africa and Asia, and they were namely Liberia and South Africa, which were former colonies in Africa, Ethiopia, which was a long-standing independent kingdom in Africa, and in Asia, China, Japan, and Siam. Nonetheless, the cat had been let out of the bag, and it was basically impossible to stop this national ideal from being adopted by people in the colonies and turned back against the European powers, much in the same way as it happened within Europe 100 years earlier in the wake of the French Revolution, when countries like Italy, Spain, Germany adopted sort of French-style nationalism and then turned it back against the French. So let's talk about nationalism then outside Europe. So the relevance of nationalism to colonial independence movements is ambiguous and debated, at least in the early periods. So if one goes back as far as the American Revolution, before the American Revolution, the colonists, the Anglo-American colonists, saw themselves primarily as British and tried to assert their rights as Englishmen. And their Britishness was sometimes expressed through local identities and provincial patriotism, but this was applied mainly to individual colonies, rarely ever to some greater entity called America or British America. Now, the Revolution did produce a sort of basic American patriotic identity with its own myths and symbols, mainly just George Washington. But it is debatable whether these early Americans had any sense of themselves as a nation. They rarely used that word, and scholars tend, at least in recent times, to say that it took a long time for an American nation or nationality to be forged. And the scholar John Murren famously argued that the early republic in the U.S. was, quote, a roof without walls. They had a constitution which set up a shared government, but no unifying identity. Now, this was followed not long after. The American and French revolutions were followed shortly after by the Haitian Revolution, in which both free and enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue overthrew French rule and created a new state. And notably, in 1804, when proclaiming their independence, they adopted the name of Haiti, which is an Arawakan Indian name for mountains. And this shows an effort to root themselves in the New World landscape and to reach back to connect this new state to Indian and pre-Columbian roots. And this was followed then by the wave of Spanish-American revolutions, some leaders of which, like Simón Bolívar, were inspired by Haiti. And these revolutions were peculiar, and they form, you could say, an interesting counterpoint to the national revolutions in Europe. They were led in Spanish America not by the literate middle classes of lawyers and professionals and artisans and writers. There just weren't many of those in the Spanish colonies, and a lot of them were Spanish, not locally born, not Creole. So those revolutions were led firstly by large landowners of the Creole class, people of European descent born in the colonies. And especially those who had built up large fortunes in the colonies resented the so-called peninsulares, the officials born in Spain, who pretty much automatically outranked them and shut them out of high government offices. So there was a power struggle between Creoles and peninsulares from the 1780s onward into the 1810s, which made it basically impossible for Creole magnates to gain the status and prestige that they felt they were entitled to. And so they fell back then on Creole patriotism centering around their own colonies and provinces. And the revolutions that they launched succeeded by the 1830s. And they succeeded by gaining broader popular support from indigenous peasants and freed slaves. And Creole leaders made significant sacrifices in wealth, land, and slaves in order to secure their independence. And no overarching Spanish-American republic was established, but instead each administrative unit more or less became its own independent republic, including most of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which became independent as Mexico, and the Viceroyalty of Peru, which became the Republic of Peru. So it's significant that by and large, these new states used Indian names, like Haiti had done. They became Mexico and Peru. And despite intense racism, which there certainly was, nonetheless the new states acknowledged the indigenous people as fellow citizens, and the vote was extended to those who at least could clear certain hurdles like literacy tests. So basically, you could argue, as some have argued, that incorporating the indigenous people into these new states and using indigenous names was a way for them to claim antiquity with roots stretching back into ancient times, even as they were clearly new creations, basically throwing together various indigenous European and African populations into this newly made national basket. So what is one to make of all this, of this sort of strangely different but parallel story in the Americas? Well, for one, it is not clear exactly how central the idea of the nation was to these revolutions. They generally called the new states republics, and it's uncertain and debatable how much they fit into the history of nations and nationalism. But still, they do illustrate several important facts. One, they show how quickly new states and identities can be forged, and how these new identities can come directly out of shifting political alliances of elites. The Creole colonial elites broke their ties with Spain and adopted the indigenous majorities as their new allies and as the main constituencies, which allowed them to create these new states. Secondly, they show how, ironically, what had been administrative units in a colonial empire could pretty quickly form these new collective identities and assert independence. And this can be seen echoed to some degree in Eastern Europe, too, and then even more later in Africa and Asia, where you see new states coming into being like, say, Nigeria, that, did not exist before colonialism, but simply transitioned from being a colonial administrative unit to a nation. So after 1870, local elites in colonies like first and most importantly India, and then also in British and French West Africa and French Indochina, began to advocate for independence from the European powers. They adopted the language of the nation and began to construct their own national narratives involving founding heroes and events, periods of foreign oppression, and they cultivated a national consciousness, which began, of course, with picking a putative national language. So one can see a lot of ironies here in that these early leaders, for one thing, they were often the most immersed in European languages and customs. One can think of Mohandas Gandhi, a British-educated lawyer trained at the Inner Temple in London, a devotee of German and English romantics who had spent much of his career in British South Africa. And also in Indochina, Ho Chi Minh, who had a French education, worked for years in the United States, Britain, and France, happened to be in Paris during the Versailles peace talks. These are the people who became crucial national leaders and symbols for these new nations like India and Vietnam. Why would this be? Well, there are many possible reasons. For one, these European-educated elites had the most distant perspective and perhaps could see beyond local, tribal, and religious differences to conceive of the colony as a unified nation. But this is not really enough of an explanation, since nation and national identity really had to be constructed. In other words, someone had to figure out what the national language would be in a multilingual country like India or Nigeria. And these particular colonial elites felt a motivation to do so, to conceive of this national idea, more so than the larger masses of peasants or laborers. And the situation for these elites can be compared to that of the Creole elites in Spanish America. So in Asia and Africa, these countries were mostly colonized later in the 19th century, and very few Europeans actually resettled in these colonies. They mainly just comprised a small administrative class, which was very thin on the ground. And in order to manage society in the colonies and collect taxes, the European states had to co-opt the local elites like tribal leaders, and further train an indigenous administrative class to manage affairs on the ground and serve as go-betweens between the population and the European powers. So this class then encountered a similar situation to the Creoles in Spanish America. They felt that they were unfairly denied the high positions to which they were entitled. They took European assumptions about the inherent difference between peoples and races and turned them around. They reconceived the colonial administrative unit as a nation which they, the local elite, were the most suited to represent since they were organic to it. So after World War II, decolonization became the order of the day, and European states accepted gradual transitions to independence, and the new states then were in turn accepted as members of the United Nations, which, right in its very name, implies that all people are properly part of and should be represented by some nation. The new states often adopted names that invoked ancient states or kingdoms predating European colonization as forerunners or precedents. Hence, a colony like the Gold Coast in West Africa became Ghana, and Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, etc. Now, some other states could not really do this because they were entirely new creations invented on the map by the European powers. For example, Indonesia. So nationalists in the 20th century wrote about the 300 years of colonial oppression that Indonesia had endured, although ironically the very idea of Indonesia had only been invented about 100 years earlier by British geographers, and most of modern-day Indonesia had only been conquered by the Dutch between about 1850 and 1910. So this was really a new concoction, but still some national identity and national history were constructed. Now, anyway, by the 1960s, it could seem as if everything was pretty well resolved. Everyone apparently belonged to some nation state or other, which enjoyed sovereignty and related to other nations as peers. So nationalism had ostensibly coalesced into a peaceable internationalism. But there were still all kinds of unresolved problems that sometimes spilled over into politics and led to conflict. And these problems were rooted in the concept of the nation. So what are some of these intractable conceptual problems with the nation? Well, they start with the simplest and most obvious problem, which is that there are many ambiguous regions or ethnic groups that can't be clearly fitted into one nation or another. And these sort of ambiguous borderline regions compose at least three different kinds. So one is border regions with mixed populations, like, say, the Sudetenland on the edge of Czechoslovakia and Germany, the Polish corridor between Germany and Poland, Northern Ireland, the Aegean coast of Anatolia with a mixed population of Greeks and Turks, the Punjab in northern India. Secondly, there are sub-regions within a state that have a stateless minority group, such as the Basque country in France and Spain, or Kurdistan, which spans Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Thirdly, there are sub-regions with some local group that may be related to the larger national group, but which is also in some way different, with its own dialect, traditions, and local identity, and which either diverged and branched off from the main body of the nation or was never fully assimilated into it in the first place. So these include, for instance, Montenegro, Is it part of Serbia? Are Montenegrins Serbs? Or are they too different to be Serbs? How different do you have to be not be the same nation? Also Ukraine, long part of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. And, as Russian nationalists will point out, Russian civilization itself began at Kiev in what's now Ukraine. Is Ukraine part of the Russian nation or is it not? Within Italy, there's Sicily, Sardinia, the Veneto, and other regions that have never been perfectly assimilated into this putative Italian nation. Similarly in France, Corsica, Brittany, Languedoc, in Ethiopia, Tigray, in China, Xinjiang, in Britain, Scotland, and Wales, which is especially interesting since today there's a significant Scottish national movement calling for independence, and critics of this movement sometimes condemn it because they reject nationalism altogether, right? And it's got that national right in the name. Scottish National Party is its main political expression. But defenders of Scottish nationalism counter that the Unionists, those who want Scotland to remain in Great Britain, are also nationalists. It's just a different nationalism. Are you part of the Scottish nation or the British nation? And this is a paradox that is not entirely unique. There are many people in different parts of the world who find two or more nationalisms competing for their loyalty, just appealing to different symbols and narratives. Are you Scottish or are you British, etc., etc. So the important thing here is not just that these ambiguities exist, but further that it seems there is no consistent way to resolve them. There is no clear criterion of what counts as a nation and who counts as a member of it. In other words, there is no consistent answer to basic questions like, how does a nation come into being? How do you know one when you see it? How do you know who is a member of it? And one or more criteria may be invoked at any given moment. One obvious answer is language. So this is the main thing that early Romantic nationalists like Herder and Fichte pointed to when they assumed that the world could be carved up into national linguistic spheres. But what are problems with this? 1, many people are bilingual or multilingual. Where do you put them? 2, many long-standing nations like Switzerland are multilingual, but no one holds that thereby they're not nations. Thirdly, many national movements do not follow along lines of language. Many of them embrace different linguistic communities, such as, for instance, Belgium, which formed out of an otherwise very typical 19th century Romantic nationalist movement. Also later anti-colonial national movements like in India. And fourthly, many national movements have formed in regions that share the exact same language as their neighbors, and even with the colonial powers that they overthrew. This is true, for instance, throughout Spanish America, where language was not an issue or a distinguishing marker at all, where it was basically the same language throughout that whole continent and was shared with the colonial power in Spain. So if we don't use language, what else can we take to distinguish a nation? Well, advocates often invoke folkways or culture, which, is just as ill-defined a term as nation or even more so. Some time ago, I went deeply into all my issues with the concept of culture. But as customarily defined, culture should include religion. But different national movements are all over the map with regard to religion. In some places, religion is used as the main criterion to define and delimit the nation, such as in the Western Balkans when it comes to the difference between Serbs and Croats. What's the difference? Serbs are Eastern Orthodox, Croats are Catholic. So that's the boundary between those nations. Also, again, if we look at Belgium, Catholicism was the marker that distinguished Belgium from the Protestant Netherlands. Meanwhile, in other places, national identity is specifically held to be separate and apart from religion. You have nations like Germany. The national identity embraces Protestants and Catholics. Also the United States and Canada and many other nations. And early on, many post-colonial states also embraced a multi-religious pluralism, such as in India, Nigeria, Lebanon, etc. But as some of you may already be thinking, this approach has broken down in many of these countries. So secular national identity has proven to be too thin or weak to hold up against against sectarian religious identities in many places. Hence, you get civil wars in Lebanon, violence in Nigeria, the partition of India, and then even after the partition, the sort of pluralist nationalism of the Congress Party, which was hegemonic early on, has been supplanted now by Hindutva, or Hindu nationalism, which equates the national identity with the indigenous religion of the subcontinent, as against other ostensibly foreign religions. So thirdly, some will put aside all of these cultural definitions about language or religion in favor of racial ones. So many nationalists hold that the nation is essentially a matter of shared ancestry and blood. But this clearly doesn't hold up to critique either. It ignores wide differences in tribes and ethnicities, apart from immigrants who can settle in all of these nations and often are naturalized as citizens of these different nation states. And besides, ancestry does not provide any clear or distinct boundaries. A person's ancestry, if one traces their genealogy, it does not go back to some single root, but quite the opposite. The family tree is a branching and tangled latticework, and the farther back you trace it, the farther it branches off in all different directions. And every population, if you look at populations, every population has intermixed with their neighbors repeatedly through the centuries, if there is even a distinct population to speak of in the first place. So even paradigmatic nation-states like Britain or France are actually complex amalgamations, with ancestry coming from pre-Indo-Europeans, Celts, Romans, Goths, Alans, Franks, Saxons, Danes, Normans, really so many different groups that you can't even really call them admixtures, because there is no original ancestrally pure body into which they could mix in the first place. And this, you could say, is really the great illusory myth of national ancestry or national genealogy. For any person or group, there is no ancestral origin point. There is just a selection of strands out of the tangled latticework of humanity that might happen to live within a certain geographic zone at a certain moment in time. So national narratives really serve as ways of sidestepping all of these difficult questions, and instead simply imagining or conjuring into being some coherent body of people moving steadily through time. And as we'll see later, this is how some theorists have really defined the nation, the group that endures and moves through historical time. So national states tend to imagine that they have deep ancient origins. They adopt founding figures who first organized the nation into a coherent state, and periods of persecution or foreign oppression which the nation survived in order to throw off the foreign yoke and assume their rightful independence. Now, these narratives also don't tend to hold up very well when examined critically. And scholars tend to find a paradox. Namely that while the idea of the nation is very new, nations everywhere are perceived to be very old. So if we look at national heroes or founding figures, they are very often purely legendary and in many cases probably never existed, like William Tell for Switzerland or Hua Mulan in China, or for instance King Arthur, who may possibly be inspired by some real historical personage, but which, has been blown up into a mythic figure entwined with legend and fantasy, who nevertheless is taken as somehow defining the English or British nation and has been used as a national symbol and is seen to kind of hold together all of British history, past, present, and future, right? He is the once and future king. There are other national heroes that define their nations that are misrepresented. So they might be real important historical figures, but they did not see themselves as part of the nation that then co-opts them. And their motives really had nothing to do with any national mission. So you can see, for instance, Charlemagne, who's taken as a French founding hero, but was a Germanic Frank who spoke mainly German and some Latin, and had no notion that there would ever be such a thing as France or the French language or people, and probably would not have cared if someone told him. He wanted to unite all of the Christian West into one empire under the Frankish crown. He had no interest in such a thing as France. Also Napoleon. Napoleon was born in Corsica, which is an Italian-speaking island, and he was born just a few months after it had been acquired by France from the Republic of Genoa. And hence, some like to say, although he was born French, he was conceived Italian. But, that's just another effort to co-opt him for another national identity. And Napoleon himself didn't especially care about French nationalism, except insofar as it helped him to cement power and support in France. There's also, for Russians, Rurik, who is seen as sort of a founding figure of Russian civilization, but he was a Norse Viking, and that word Rus originally means men who row, referring to Vikings. There is also Boudica in Great Britain, the Celtic queen in Roman-era Britain who led a revolt against Rome. She's often seen as a progenitor of the British or English nation, although she mainly just cared about her particular tribe, the Iceni, whom the Romans, in her view, had insulted. And she did not think that there was any such thing as a British kingdom or nation or people, much less English. In Egypt, there's some controversy over whether to view Muhammad Ali as a national hero. So this was the Ottoman governor of Egypt in the early 1800s who rebelled against the Ottoman Empire and established himself as an autonomous ruler or khedive and instituted aggressive modernizing reforms. So he's often invoked as the founding figure of modern Egypt. But as critics point out, he was actually from Albania and was installed as governor by the Turks. Hence, you could easily say he was a foreign colonizer, an enemy of the nation. So what comes out of all this is that national histories are back projections in which many people and events are co-opted into narratives that would make little sense to the people themselves in their own time, or that would even be inconceivable to their views of the world. These were worlds that were delimited by completely different social structures, like tribes, empires, and dynastic and religious realms. So already by the mid-1800s, scholars and intellectuals saw the organic and ethno-linguistic definition of the nation as untenable, and they began trying to define what a nation really was in terms of how people took up and used the word. Right? What did the nation mean? This was not a term originally put forward by some philosopher who defined what he was talking about, so it had to be analyzed critically. And this problem was taken up most of all by French scholars, who viewed the nation very differently from the German idealists before them. So German idealists saw the nation as existing in the society or the folk outside the state or prior to the state. French intellectuals more often saw it as a creation of the state, and hence inherently political from its conception. And these French analysts of the nation most often came from minority ethnic groups and marginal regions in France that did not fit well into this mythic France, and hence maybe they were naturally critical of it or skeptical of it. The first impactful effort to define the nation was put forward by Ernest Renan, a French biblical scholar and Orientalist who was from Brittany, that northwestern Celtic region of France. So in 1882, Renan published Qu'est-ce qu'une nation, or What is a Nation, which argued that the nation should not be confused with a linguistic grouping, nor is it founded on shared religion. As he pointed out, one can be Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, or no religion, and still belong to the French or British or German nation. Nor is it a matter of blood. As Renan argued, quote, the most noble countries, England, France, and Italy, are the ones where the blood is most mixed. Rather, he argued nations form from an act of will, whereby diverse social groupings intentionally seek to create a shared identity. And nations continue through time because their members choose to continue to identify with them. And he wrote famously, quote, the existence of a nation, you will pardon me this metaphor, is a daily plebiscite, just as the continuing existence of an individual is a perpetual affirmation of life, end quote. So people choose to affirm their shared nationality because it makes them part of a great ongoing story, and the national narrative is the essence of it all. quote, "A heroic past with great men and glory, I mean true glory, is the social capital upon which the national idea rests. These are the essential conditions of being a people, having common glories in the past and a will to continue them in the present, having made great things together and wishing to make them again." End quote. So nationality, again, it's a matter of will and choice, almost as if people are getting up each day and casting a vote that they still want to be part of this nation. Now, the flip side of this national narrative and mythologization is forgetting, and this is probably the most notorious part of Renan's argument. So he claimed that a nation must affirm itself by forgetting its divisions and its heterogeneity. And he wrote, quote, "The essence of a nation is not only that all individuals have many things in common, but also that they have forgotten many things. Every French citizen has to have forgotten the massacre of St. Bartholomew or the massacres that took place in the South in the 13th century." End quote. So hence, the nation makes a collective choice to forget the violence and the force that created the unified state and to drop the divisions and the hatreds that might derive from that past violence. Now, as critics have pointed out, in fact, the French people do remember events like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which are taught in schools as part of the national history. And Renan's essay itself implies this by invoking the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre without explaining what it is. He just assumes that his audience will be familiar with it. But I would say that this criticism rather misunderstands what Renan means here. He is not saying that French people literally forget that these things happened, but rather I think that they choose to put them aside as irrelevant to their present-day loyalties. Whereas by contrast, nationalists tend to emphasize past atrocities and defeats like, say, the Battle of Kosovo or the massacre at Amritsar or the Boston Massacre, that underscore the distinction between the putative nation and their foreign enemies. Right? So certain acts of violence, certain atrocities are cherished and clung to as relevant to the present world, and others are put aside as unimportant. So many see Renan's theory as too cynical and basically see him as saying that the nation is a fraud or an illusion. Now, I would tend to disagree with that. I think nation building does often involve some degree of fraud or illusion, but ultimately, they are simply a matter of how people choose to create alliances and engage in collective endeavors. In other words, they are at root political. And alliances and projects involve creating what historians now like to call a usable past, right? You find what in the past is useful to the message you want to send and the relationships you want to create today. Now, regardless of that, by the end of the 19th century, there was some movement towards compromise and nuance. And this came especially from sociologists who wanted to analyze the underpinnings of society, how it constructs shared identities, and they seek to account for why people both adopt identities and cleave to them with great passion. So many early sociologists who studied ethnicity and identity also came from the sort of borderline, more or less literal, of France, especially the border areas of France and Germany, which were much contended over as a sort of gray zone between the French nation and the German nation. The most influential of these was Emile Durkheim, who was a Jewish Frenchman from Alsace, right in that disputed zone. He wrote about tribal and religious identities as sort of a foundation, the building blocks of greater identities. He did not tackle the nation specifically as a category, but it happens that his nephew did. So his nephew Marcel Mauss was also Alsatian Jewish, and in 1953 he wrote La Nation. And in this work, Mauss defined a nation as, quote, a materially and morally integrated society with a stable, permanent central power, with fixed frontiers, with inhabitants relatively at one morally, mentally, and culturally, who consciously adhere to the state and to its laws, end quote. Now, you might notice this definition is rather unwieldy. It's very long, it has a lot of clauses, and it tries to yoke together both cultural and political factors. right? It's defined by a shared loyalty to a state and also by moral, mental, and cultural unity. So this is a very elaborate definition, and a clear problem with it is that by this definition, hardly any nations exist or ever have, right? Who could possibly meet all these qualifications? Every state, including definitive nation states like France or Germany, every state is heterogeneous with different regions, ethnic groups, and is politically and ideologically divided with different factions and movements vying for power. So there's no state that you could point to that I think meets this very far-reaching definition of the nation. And over time, the critique of the idea of the nation, the political critique, the sociological critique, leads, I think you could say, into greater and greater cynicism and slides eventually into total relativism. For example, in 1964, Ernest Gellner published the book Thought and Change, in which he said, quote, "Nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness. It invents nations where they do not exist," end quote. So this is another notorious quote which reflects, I think, an increasingly common scholarly opinion. And it was put into a more pithy or humorous form in 1969 by Karl Deutsch in his book Nationality and Its Alternatives, in which he famously wrote, quote, "A nation is a group of persons united by a common error about their ancestry and a common dislike of their neighbors," end quote. And in 1977, the scholar Hugh Seaton Watson in Nations and States, you could say, basically threw up his hands and refused to offer any definition of the nation at all. Basically just said, there's a nation when people say there is. And he wrote, quote, "All that I can find to say is that a nation exists when a significant number of people in a community consider themselves to form a nation and behave as if they formed one," end quote. So at this point, you might say things seem to have gotten to a dead end, right? It's a completely relative term. It means whatever people want it to mean. If you say you're a nation, whatever. And you might suppose that at this point, the matter is exhausted. But in fact, it was not. Already by this point in the 1970s, there was a new wave of scholarship emerging, which reopened the whole topic and went a step further and sought to account, not necessarily just to define what is a nation, but to account for how and why nationalism and the idea of the nation arose in the first place. And this was spurred on largely by British Marxists, who were prompted, as Marxists often are, by a set of events that did not fit into their preconceived theory of history, dialectical materialism. So specifically, they were confronted by wars that took place between putatively communist states, which started going to war with one another based on national goals and interests. And these wars had no apparent basis or rationale in Marxist theory. If you're all communist, you should be past ethnic and tribal loyalties. You should be joining together into this, spreading global workers' revolution. So many Marxists were left flummoxed in the 1970s and asked, why have national loyalties not simply been swept away in this international workers' movement? And why are people still acting as if they cared about their national loyalties? So firstly, in 1971, sort of the doyen of British Marxism, Eric Hobsbawm, proposed that scholars should turn away from a focus on Europe and look instead at Africa and Asia. And he posed a hypothesis in the form of a question. He wrote, quote, "To what extent is the nation an attempt to fill the void left by the dismantling of earlier community and social structures by inventing something which could function as or produce symbolic substitutes for the functioning of a consciously apprehended community or society?" End quote. So it gets wordy at the end there, but he's basically saying older forms of community had somehow broken down. That's a common Marxist observation. So perhaps the nation comes in to fill the void and substitute. So Hobsbawm floated this important idea that the nation fills a vacuum, and it became very influential. And some scholars took that up and ran with it, but others rejected it. For instance, in 1976, the French scholar Eugène Weber wrote a very influential book called Peasants into Frenchmen, and he explores the ways in which the French state, both before and after the Revolution, actively intervened in society to try to reorient people's loyalties to the new national state. So he really argues for the fundamentally political nature of the nation and the important driving role of the state in creating national identity. So he basically answered no to Hobsbawm's question, and he wrote, quote, "This actually reverses the order of events, at least in regard to France. In France, the political nation of the Ancien Régime functioned side by side with traditional community and social structures. The ideological nation of the Revolution had to compete with these. It was not invented upon their dismantling. Its invention implied their dismantling." End quote. So there was an active ideological campaign here. Now, this debate about why do people think they belong to nations, where did nationalism come from, this debate continues on into the 80s. And the most influential work to come out of this period, which tried to synthesize a new theory of the rise of the nation, was published in 1983 by the Irish Marxist scholar Benedict Anderson. So Benedict Anderson he had a lot of Marxist views and background, and he also was shocked by the wars in Southeast Asia between communist states like Vietnam and Cambodia. And he argued that both Marxists and liberal scholars had underestimated the power and the staying power of nationalism, which leads many people to be willing to die for their nations, even as the nation is so difficult to define. And he pointed out that nationalism contains deep paradoxes. As we saw, nationalism is new, but each nation always sees itself to be old. Nationalism is universal in that it holds that everybody belongs to a nation, but each nation is seen to be bounded and limited. So Anderson put forward his own definition of what constituted a nation, and he famously wrote, quote, "It is an imagined political community and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign," end quote. So Benedict Anderson, I think, sought out a middle ground. He cautioned that imagined here should not be taken to mean invented in the negative sense of fake or counterfeit, but rather in the sense of created or constructed. And he pointed out that all communities were imagined. And he wrote, quote, "In fact, all communities larger than primordial villages of face-to-face contact, and perhaps even these, are imagined. Communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity versus genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined," end quote. So older communities like pre-revolutionary France or pre-colonial Java were imagined by their members as extended webs of personal ties, not as unified or homogeneous groups bound by a shared story or shared traits that transcend individual relationships. And more specifically, what distinguishes the nation from these older communities is a matter of how it is understood to be constituted and to work and operate in time. So time is critical in Anderson's argument. All nations, in his view, quote, "loom out of an immemorial past, and still more important, glide into a limitless future." So I think he sums up the fundamental importance of time in this new concept of the nation when he writes, quote, "The idea of a sociological organism moving calendrically through homogeneous empty time is a precise analog of the idea of the nation, which also is conceived as a solid community moving steadily down history. An American will never meet or even know the names of more than a handful of his 240 million odd fellow Americans. He has no idea what they are up to at any one time, but he has complete confidence in their steady, anonymous, simultaneous activity." End quote. So Anderson accounts for the rise of the nation and nationalism through a combination of old and new arguments. So he argues, for one thing, that nationalism first arose in the 1700s because it filled the vacuum left behind by declining religious faith. So he is, in a way, in some agreement here with Hobsbawm. He argues that nationalism offers a substitute for older religious ideas of eternal life and of overcoming mortality, and it provides a narrative that gives meaning to suffering and links the past, present, and future. So, if that is what nationalism had to offer, what made this profound reconception of the world possible? Well, Anderson stresses the importance of print in creating broad linguistic spheres with bodies of vernacular literature. But he also gets much more specific and argues for the particular importance of two print media, namely the novel and the newspaper. And he discusses them in that order, but I'll reverse them for this discussion. So firstly, if we look at newspapers, Anderson argues that they were crucial in creating a different sense of time and history. Events were no longer seen as guided by divine providence, situated in history by their meanings and place in some providential scheme. Instead, events are situated in empty linear time, right, demarcated by dates one day after another, and hence people's lives could be seen as lived out simultaneously in one continuous narrative unfolding through history. So this shift makes it possible for people to think of themselves as belonging to a sort of extended collective of peers that are able to think and act in concert, right, in the same moment. And he notes the importance of the ephemeral value of each newspaper issue, right? And he writes, quote, "The obsolescence of the newspaper on the morrow of its printing creates this extraordinary mass ceremony. We know that particular morning and evening editions will overwhelmingly be consumed between this hour and that, only on this day, not that. The significance of this mass ceremony, Hegel observed that newspapers serve modern man as a substitute for morning prayers, is paradoxical. It is performed in silent privacy in the lair of the skull. Yet each communicant is well aware that the ceremony he performs is being replicated simultaneously by thousands or millions of others, of whose existence he is confident, yet of whose identity he has not the slightest notion. Furthermore, the ceremony is incessantly repeated at daily or half-daily intervals throughout the calendar. What more vivid figure for the secular, historically clocked, imagined community can be envisioned? At the same time, the newspaper reader, observing exact replicas of his own paper being consumed by his subway, barbershop, or residential neighbors, is continually reassured that the imagined world is visibly rooted in everyday life, creating that remarkable confidence of community in anonymity, which is the hallmark of modern nations." End quote. So there's a lot packed in here, of course. Note, for one, you may notice this use of religious terms. This is a ceremony. Each newspaper reader is a communicant, one who receives communion. It takes the place of prayers. So this emphasizes the substitutionary role, right, where the nation is seen to fill in the gap left behind by the decline of religion. And further, Anderson argues that the ritual of the newspaper paves the way for formal national rituals, like the ceremonies around the tombs of the unknown soldier, which ritualize unity in anonymity. Right? You don't know who these people are, they are nameless to you, but you still are conscious that they exist and they somehow belong to some larger collective body that you belong to as well. Then secondly, Anderson argues for the significance of novels, which he says play a similar role. And he argues that they bridge the gap from the personal to the social. Novels encourage readers to think of their lives and activities as happening simultaneously, as part of the activities of some greater social organism, and hence it cultivates a sense of simultaneity. So he goes into great depth explaining how the narrator of a novel can see events happening almost like activities laid out on a map in the way that the individual person cannot. And so it paints this social picture. And he gives as an example of this the opening of a classic Filipino novel called Noli Me Tangere, which was published in the Philippines in 1887 by Jose Rizal, a founder of the Filipino national movement. So this novel, the first few paragraphs, read, quote, Towards the end of October, Don Santiago de los Santos, popularly known as Captain Tiago, was giving a dinner party. Although, contrary to his usual practice, he had announced it only that afternoon, it was already the subject of every conversation in Binondo, in other quarters of the city, and even in the walled inner city of Intramuros. In those days, Captain Tiago had the reputation of a lavish host. It was known that his house, like his country, closed its doors to nothing, except to commerce and to any new or daring idea. So the news coursed like an electric shock through the community of parasites, spongers, and gate crashers, whom God in his infinite goodness created and so tenderly multiplies in Manila. Some hunted polish for their boots, others looked for collar buttons and cravats. But one and all were preoccupied with the problem of how to greet their host with the familiarity required to create the appearance of long-standing friendship, or, if need be, to excuse themselves for not having arrived earlier. The dinner was being given at a house in Anloag Street. Since we do not recall the street number, we shall describe it in such a way that it may still be recognized. That is, if earthquakes have not yet destroyed it." End quote. So, in this passage, Benedict Anderson points out this description of the news spreading and many different people reacting to it all through the city of Manila. And the narrator here attributes all kinds of ideas and feelings and intentions to everybody in whole neighborhoods or the whole city. Relationships among these people surely must exist, but they are depersonalized and generalized. And Anderson argues that this cultivates the idea of a single community which can think and act and behave as one. So now at this point, I will pause here just to make a few comments on Anderson's theory and its strengths and weaknesses. So the book does go on to discuss other matters like empire and racism, but nonetheless, I would say that there are certain strengths to this sort of core beginning of the book. I do think that Anderson is right about the importance of time and the fact that the nation exists and operates in worldly or literally secular time. I do think he's right, and he makes a good argument that newspapers are very important in conjuring up a single linguistic community that's understood to move together through time, and hence many early nationalist leaders, like, say, Cavour in Italy, published newspapers. I also think that he is onto something about novels, but maybe not in quite the way that he argues. So novels clearly are also important to many national movements. And many nationalist leaders, like Garibaldi, also wrote novels. Also, you might remember Saddam Hussein also wrote several novels, which some people are surprised to learn. And novels, too, are clearly related to newspapers. There's a lot of crossover between them, with many classic novels like Dickens's being first published serially in periodicals, and others like Vanity Fair using newspaper dispatches as framing devices to mark events in time and to relate individual activities and experiences to the sort of grander events of the time. So novels, I think, play a similar role here to newspapers in both implying and cultivating a broad, anonymous reading public and an image of a sort of typical reader, an anonymous typical reader. But I would say also novels seem to come relatively late to the nationalist game. And Anderson cites this example of Noli Me Tangere, which comes from 1887. So it's early and foundational in the Filipino national movement, but it was long after nationalism was already widespread over much of the world and had been entrenched all across Europe. So novels sometimes might be turned to nationalistic purposes, but also really I would say, firstly, this was not necessary to building national identities, and secondly, it was just one of the many uses of novels. It was one of the many ways that social novels could comment on and depict society in a broad sense. So novels are very well suited because, it's prose, you can include whatever you want, you can go on as long as you want. Novels are well suited to building a picture through the accumulation of small details. And specifically, as we said, novels can serve to bridge the gap between the concrete, specific details of a person's life and a broad, abstract picture of the society that they belong to. So many classic novels about specific characters and which deal with particular people's lives, they often begin with broad statements about some abstract society. And I think this is even pushed to a satirical extreme in the famous opening of Pride and Prejudice, which reads, quote, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife," end quote. So this is a sort of ironic overstatement, right? Who says that this is a universal truth? But it signals that the obsessions of these particular people will illustrate and exemplify broader social norms. And this effect is not necessarily linked to national sentiments. So if we look again at Noli Me Tangere, Anderson emphasizes the way that the narrator describes Manila in broad impersonal strokes. But what struck me and what I noted in reading that passage was the way that the narrator explicitly leaves out the main character's street address. He says the dinner was being held at a house whose number we've forgotten, so we'll just move on past that. And to me, this called to my mind the opening of Don Quixote, which I talk about repeatedly all the time, which famously begins, quote, "In a certain village of La Mancha, of which I cannot remember the name, there lived not long ago one of those old-fashioned gentlemen who are never without a lance upon a rack, an old target, a lean horse, and a greyhound for racing," end quote. So you may note here in this classic, founding novel from the 1600s, just like in Noli Me Tangere, the narrator explicitly forgets the precise place where the main character lives. In Don Quixote, we then get lots of details about Alonso Quijano's lifestyle, what he ate, what he wore, how he spent his time. But we're never told exactly where he lived, and the non-specific location is foregrounded to the reader, as if to say and to point out it is important to note that this character is not tied to a specific place. Why would that be? Well, I would say that's because this character is intended to represent a social archetype more than any actual specific person. And this is probably the same reason that many novels, especially American novels, have anonymous main characters who not only are tied to a specific site, but don't have a specific name, such as in The Virginian and The Invisible Man. So here you have unnamed main characters that are supposed to typify some sort of element of society. The Virginian perhaps is the quintessential self-reliant, rugged individualist, and the Invisible Man stands in for the Black American experience. So both of these, you could say, represent some part of the greater American social picture, but through a specific element of it. And in the case of Don Quixote, if we go back to that, you could say Alonso Quijano represents the Hidalgo class, right? The minor nobles who fell from importance, and their sort of vestigial, overinflated self-image. And this, I think, is what most classic novels are really about. They're about illustrating social types and especially class. Nation, I think, is usually secondary, and even when it is important, the picture of the nation is constructed through class. So perhaps Anderson is right here to overlook class, which he, barely discusses or glosses over. Perhaps he's right to do so in the sense that nationalism itself tends to elide class distinctions, and that is the mentality that he's trying to capture. But at the same time, it was usually the middle class that conceived and promoted national movements, and novels and newspapers were usually produced by and for a middle class reading public. So class is necessarily part of the picture. So one could ask then, well, what then defines and unites a nation across lines of class? How do you overcome those divides in status, in power, and wealth, and construct an idea, a concept of the organically united nation? Well, this then points to other factors that I would say are de-emphasized in Anderson's theory. One is race and ethnicity. So this comes in fairly late in Anderson's book, although he does discuss it. He defines a nation, as we saw, as inherently limited or bounded. But that only raises the question, limited by what? What defines this boundary of the nation, who's in and who's out? And the most common answer you would get, I think, if you ask committed nationalists, is blood, right? Ancestry and blood define the nation. The nation is understood as a kind of extended family with some shared ancestral root. And Anderson, for his part, he focuses on how the nation can be imagined as a collective entity moving together through time. But he doesn't address the fact that from very early on, nations were understood not just as reading publics, but as these extended families linked by kinship. And even today, Anderson's theory often sounds like a rejection of the basic idea of the nation, which even still today is usually understood as a given fact of nature, right? And nature and nation come from that common root, birth. So that does not mean, therefore, that the idea of the nation is always necessarily based in blood or kinship, but they are pretty closely tied and hard to separate. One can, in principle, I would say in principle at least, one can recognize that nations are invented. In other words, they are created in historical time by active choice. They are not fixed categories of birth or nature. They do not emerge out of the mists of time. One can affirm these things without thereby saying that nations have no legitimacy. So communities have to come from somewhere, and they can derive from a shared political commitment to certain principles and from the act of choosing to create a civic community. So this can broadly be called civic nationalism. And there are civic nationalist movements, but they tend to have to thread a difficult needle. On the one hand, claiming legitimacy as representing a real nation, but without rooting that nation in a supposed ancestral group, and without drawing clear boundaries based on blood or ethnicity. So, for instance, in Scotland, we mentioned the SNP, the Scottish National Party, which advocates for Scottish independence from the UK. And you could say this movement plays a kind of double game by implicitly assuming the continuous existence of a nation with all of its symbols and myths, right? Encapsulated in the name Scotland, while at the same time rhetorically rejecting ethno-nationalism and rejecting clear boundaries between insiders and outsiders. Hence, the SNP expresses greater support for immigration and for membership in the EU than do other parties in Britain. And hence the SNP, in its rhetoric, it eschews reference to the Scottish people, which can sound too ethnic or exclusionary, in favor instead of the people of Scotland as a sort of geographic unit. Now, one could see this as kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too. But you can also see it as trying to be, in some sense, more honest, right? Appealing to an idea of political independence and political nationality with historical identity as a sort of add-on, and assuming some degree of demographic change and heterogeneity. But the question then that doesn't answer is this civic nationalism really viable? Thus far, it hasn't achieved the goal of Scottish independence. And one could say that even states that have based themselves on a sort of civic nationalism, it's not really stable. It doesn't necessarily last and survive well through time. Things tend often to collapse into some kind of racial or ethno-nationalism. So finally, I'd like to look at the United States briefly, the country where I live, which can be seen as kind of the quintessential civic national state. And it can bring out a lot of the complications, both in the conventional understanding of the nation and in sociological theories like Anderson's, which try to define the nation socially, politically, historically. So the United States, of course, has a lot of founding national myths and national festivals and songs, just like many other nation-states. And it has national rituals, including those around the tomb of the unknown soldier, that serve to cultivate a sort of group identity. However, when the U.S. was first created in the American Revolution, it initially had none of these things, and it had to consciously create them. And as mentioned, the country was a so-called roof without walls, right? A purely political construction with no national identity. Certain members of the elite, the English-speaking North American elite, had to try to set about forging a nation, and a very important and revealing one was Noah Webster, who was a school teacher, so, a fairly ordinary man, but who had been educated at Yale. and so in his way belonged to the intellectual elite of this new country. And in 1785, just after the Revolution, when the country was still really a loose confederation and didn't even have like a national army or judiciary, Webster published an essay called Sketches of American Policy, and he advocated that America should foster greater social and political unity. And he wrote, quote, "America is an independent empire and ought to assume a national character," end quote. So what does this mean? It seems to imply that a national character, is not just a given fact of nature. It's something you have to create and adopt. And to illustrate what he was talking about, he wrote, quote, "We ought not to consider ourselves as inhabitants of a single state only, but as Americans, as the common subjects of a great empire," end quote. So this shows that national character had to be consciously adopted and cultivated through a conscious act of will. And the means that Webster recommended in order to do so were, for one thing, creating a stronger federal government, right? So he sees a stronger state as sort of the precondition of having a nation. And this supreme power would ensure unity, and it would cultivate distinct American customs while rejecting European customs. And he wrote, quote, "Nothing can be more ridiculous than a servile imitation of the manners, the language, and the vices of foreigners. Nothing can betray a more despicable disposition in Americans than to be the apes of Europeans," end quote. And he held this to be true, most importantly of all, in language. So he despised pretentious, affected Americans who, quote, "must in all their discourse mingle in a spice of sans souci and je ne sais quoi," end quote. So, it seems when he says Europeans here, he mainly means the French, but also the British. And he saw changes in language as politically impactful, and hence the language had to be shaped towards political ends. And hence he had a political motive for compiling the first American dictionary, which took many years, and it was finally published in 1828 when Webster was 70 years old. It had 70,000 entries, and it tried to surpass Samuel Johnson's classic dictionary of the English language. And in this dictionary, Webster really glossed over regional differences between different American states and sought to standardize an American form of English, which would be uniform and would also be distinct from British English. And significantly, he codified certain spellings that diverged from the conventions in Great Britain. Hence, Noah Webster and Webster's dictionary are the main reason why Americans spell words like color, honor, and gray, etc., differently from Britons. So if you're annoyed by American spellings, you can blame Webster. He's also the reason why if an educated reader opens up a book and starts reading, they can tell pretty quickly whether it's American or British. And that's not because there was some natural divergence. It's because of a political project to create an American national character. And as we said, also Webster advocated for a stronger federal government, and he got it. So much like in France, in the United States, this national state, through schools and universities, the postal service, the courts, and the military, created and cultivated a national identity. So Anderson, I would say, to go back to Anderson's theory, he underestimates the role of institutions and especially of the state. So his theory might be able to help explain how nations first became conceivable, but conception is only one part of the story. Right? It does not account for how large populations came to believe in these nations and to see themselves as part of them. And that was a much longer process in which state power was necessary to actually realize the nation on the ground. And this is equally true in Italy or Japan or Egypt, much as it was in the US. It's just that in the US, you have this earlier revolution, which happens before there is any sort of national identity. And what's distinctive about the United States, hence, is that the American identity from its beginning has always been highly political and ideological, based around certain civic and political ideals of liberty, limited government, and the Constitution. And in the American civic religion, the country is understood to be heterogeneous, accepting and assimilating various ethnic groups as long as they embrace these core civic principles. Now, of course, this is not to say that American nationalism is totally non-racist or non-racial. Rather, the civic understanding of American identity always exists in tension with an ethno-racial version, which elevates Northern European blood and ancestry and denigrates others or excludes them entirely from Americanness. So a lot of American politics and literature you can see as caught up with or obsessed with the conflict between these two definitions of American identity. So I want to end, after I've gone on for so long, I want to end finally by reading another opening of a novel. So this one is the novel Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, which was published in 1975, and hence about 70 years or so after the time period it's describing, which is the early 1900s. So Ragtime is an example of historical fiction, this genre first invented by Walter Scott in the Waverley novels, and which is often used for social and political commentary. And Ragtime was first published in the 1970s, in fact in 1975, just 1 year before the bicentennial of the American founding. And this was a time of great national angst and self-doubt, a lot of hand-wringing about the direction of the country and what it meant to be American. So first I'll just read the first paragraph of Ragtime, which will sound like it must be several paragraphs, but in fact it's just one. So it reads, quote, "In 1902, Father built a house at the crest of the Broadview Avenue Hill in New Rochelle, New York. It was a 3-story brown shingle with dormers, bay windows, and a screened porch. Striped awnings shaded the windows. The family took possession of this stout manse on a sunny day in June, and it seemed for some years thereafter that all their days would be warm and fair. The best part of Father's income was derived from the manufacture of flags and buntings and other accoutrements of patriotism, including fireworks. Patriotism was a reliable sentiment in the early 1900s. Teddy Roosevelt was president. The population customarily gathered in great numbers, either out of doors for parades, public concerts, fish fries, political picnics, social outings, or indoors in meeting halls, vaudeville theaters, operas, ballrooms. There seemed to be no entertainment that did not involve great swarms of people. Trains and steamers and trolleys moved them from one place to another. That was the style. That was the way people lived. Women were stouter then. They visited the fleet carrying white parasols. Everyone wore white in summer. Tennis rackets were hefty and the racket faces elliptical. There was a lot of sexual fainting. There were no Negroes. There were no immigrants. On Sunday afternoon, after dinner, Father and Mother went upstairs and closed the bedroom door. Grandfather fell asleep on the divan in the parlor. The little boy in the sailor blouse sat on the screened porch and waved away the flies. Down at the bottom of the hill, Mother's younger brother boarded the streetcar and rode to the end of the line. He was a lonely, withdrawn young man with blonde mustaches, and he was thought to be having difficulty finding himself. The end of the line was an empty field of tall marsh grasses. The air was salt. Mother's younger brother, in his white linen suit and boater, rolled his trousers and walked barefoot in the salt marshes. Seabirds started up and flew. This was the time in our history when Winslow Homer was doing his painting. A certain light was still available along the eastern seaboard. Homer painted the light. It gave the sea a heavy, dull menace and shone coldly on the rocks and shoals of the New England coast. There were unexplained shipwrecks and brave tow-line rescues. Odd things went on in lighthouses and in shacks nestled in the wild beach plum. Across America, sex and death were barely distinguishable. Runaway women died in the rigors of ecstasy. Stories were hushed up and reporters paid off by rich families. One read between the lines of the journals and gazettes. In New York City, the papers were full of the shooting of the famous architect Stanford White by Harry K. Thaw, eccentric scion of a coke and railroad fortune. Harry K. Thaw was the husband of Evelyn Nesbit, the celebrated beauty who had once been Stanford White's mistress. The shooting took place in the roof garden of the Madison Square Garden on 26th Street, a spectacular block-long building of yellow brick and terracotta that White himself had designed in the civilian style. It was the opening night of a revue entitled Mademoiselle Champagne, and as the chorus sang and danced, the eccentric scion, wearing on this summer night a straw boater and heavy black coat, pulled out a pistol and shot the famous architect 3 times in the head. On the roof, there were screams. Evelyn fainted. She had been a well-known artist's model at the age of 15. Her underclothes were white. Her husband habitually whipped her. She happened once to meet Emma Goldman, the revolutionary. Goldman lashed her with her tongue. Apparently, there were Negroes. There were immigrants. And though the newspapers called the shooting the crime of the century, Goldman knew it was only 1906, and there were 94 years to go. End quote. So there's a lot to say here. This is, an intentionally long, almost phantasmagoric paragraph with a sort of hint of stream of consciousness, but significantly it jumps almost frenetically back and forth between the specific and the personal and the broad and the social, right? These individual people and their little habits and obsessions, and this enormous sweeping picture with these giant crowds moving from place to place. And if you read it on the page, you'll notice, for one thing, the anonymity of the main characters, right? It sounds at first, when we hear about father and mother, it sounds as if we're hearing from a specific person talking directly about their family. But in fact, that's not true. These characters have no names. That's why they're referred to as father and mother and grandfather and mother's younger brother. So although they are situated in a specific town, in a specific house, they become nameless archetypes. You also might notice the references here to the newspaper headlines and to celebrities, which place these people's lives into the grand sweep of events, and even more so suggests that they embed themselves into the wider thoughts and obsessions of this great public mass. Also, there are these references to the great crowds of people moving to and fro from one mass event or spectacle to the next, which suggests that these main characters are losing their individuality by their absorption into this national mass. There's the specific connection between this anonymizing consuming mass and patriotism. Right? These events, these fish fries and picnics and balls, these are American patriotic events. And we're told that this family makes its money by supplying flags and bunting and fireworks to this mass market, right? Patriotism is a matter of mass production and consumption. And finally, there's this ironic framing of the whole passage by these repeating lines, right? In the middle, there were no immigrants, there were no Negroes. And then afterwards, when this character is confronted by Emma Goldman, there were immigrants, there were Negroes. And this illustrates, I think, how this mass public was built on illusion, right? This undifferentiated mass into which the individual could be absorbed really depends upon a decision to ignore or to exclude from view those who are different, those who don't fit the homogeneous image of the nation, right? Homogeneity depends upon willful ignorance and self-deception. And this can be seen as a good illustration then of what Ernest Renan described, right? National identity depends upon a shared decision to forget. The difference here is that the forgetting is not of unpleasant aspects of the past, but rather of unwanted aspects of the present, right? People you want to forget about. So all in all, I would say this passage expresses a sort of complex mix of nostalgia and cynicism, almost reminiscent of a person recalling their perceptions from childhood, right? I thought the world worked this way. I thought everyone was the same. And I would guess that perhaps the author, Doctorow, is trying here to sort of seek out and define America, not as a homogeneity, but rather as a kind of problem or dilemma that crystallized in this moment in time, this moment in history. And to define America as a sort of set of beliefs and illusions that could be frozen like the frame of a movie. So all in all, I think it shows an ambivalence, right? The book is playing a sort of double game, both trying to deconstruct and satirize a certain conception of America, while at the same time constructing in its place a more nuanced vision of the nation in its place, right, with all of its tensions and contradictions and social problems, again, by illustrating how the life of the mass is instantiated in the small personal lives of individuals. And racism plays a particular and important role in this sort of vision of the American nation. It plays the role of erasing or suppressing difference, and hence of trying to elide the inherent tensions and contradictions between the different versions of American identity, right? The civic and the ethno-racial. So at the time that Dr. O is writing, this is just after the civil rights movement, when it might have seemed that civic nationalism had triumphed. But Dr. O probably knew that it was not so simple, that civic nationalism is always fragile. It just does not seem to have the same sort of emotional power or staying power of ethno-nationalism. At least that's the factor that I would add in here. And I would say that this is because civic nationalism doesn't speak to the individual in quite the same way. Right? Hardcore ethno-nationalism makes very strong claims, claiming to represent and reveal the true essence of the individual, and to merge it into a larger, enduring group essence. Hence the great importance of death and memorialization of fallen soldiers and of martyrs. This represents the merging of the individual life into the greater collective and the overcoming of mortality and a secular afterlife. And in past eras, this was achieved also through veneration of the ancestors, those who are connected to you across time by blood, right? And ethno-nationalism offers that kind of power. Moreover, the importance of national history and the insistence on antiquity. If the nation has a fixed and unique essence, which joins each individual to the collective, then the nation is, in a sense, elemental. It forms a basic building block of the world, an idea that is always then reinforced by world maps and globes, in which the world is divided up into these discrete interlocking states, each with its distinct color. And it's reinforced also by global organizations like the UN, which dramatize the world as a kind of parliament of nations, each one embodied by an individual ambassador. So all in all, what I'm trying to say is that ethno-nationalism, or this sort of strong version of nationalism, imagines each nation as a kind of distinct element of the world, and an element by definition is eternal. If we think of the traditional elements of ancient physics, earth, air, water, and fire, each one of them is basic and irreducible and co-eternal with the world itself. It cannot be created by the mixing or rearranging of other elements. It cannot be constituted from the other elements except by the mysterious transmutations of alchemy, and it cannot be destroyed either. Hence, the nation, in the strong sense, is a kind of invisible essence, a basic building block of the social world, which likewise cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be revealed or obscured, freed or oppressed. And it must exist, in a sense, outside of history, while also acting in history, almost like a god or gods acting through divine providence. And the nation then gives legitimacy to the nation state, precisely because it exists as a natural given element of the world, with or without a state, and its nationhood is expressed only or manifested only through the state. So this is the real reason, I think, in my opinion, why many people are off-put or confused by Anderson's description of nations as imagined communities, and by this whole historical critique of nationalism, because it seems to deny this basic intuitive sense that the nation exists beyond politics and beyond time, and that history seems to be completely secularized. Without nations, there is nothing left to replace divine providence. There's no deeper source of authority to give meaning and order to history, nothing to elevate events above the mere vagaries of power politics. And yes, it is true there are still other grand universalist narratives like Marxism and Christian providentialism, which can give that sort of grand overarching meaning to history. But those are not faring very well, right? They're not looking so good since at least the 70s. And there is also still liberal democratic humanism, which at least since World War I has been strong and widespread in the world. But since World War I, the nation has been assumed to be the main vehicle through which liberal democracy will be spread and realized. And those who subscribe to liberal humanism are still, in a way, trying to make the world safe for democracy by remapping the world into sovereign nation-states. Without the legitimacy of the nation, it is hard to see how liberal democracy can be sustained, much less advanced and universalized. So I think we are stuck ultimately with a kind of paradox. The nation, I would say, is inherently political. It is conceived through political alliances and movements and built through law and state action. But by its nature, in order to be real or legitimate, and in order to command loyalty, by its nature, the nation must be understood as eternal, elemental, and pre-political. And while it is easy to critique it as artificial, we don't really have a compelling alternative way to understand and organize the world without it. But, who knows what the future holds. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to thank my patrons, and since we are approaching the month of September, as is my custom, I will thank all of my current active patrons who originally signed up in the month of September. So thank you to Ozzy Elowich, Kirill Trapeznikov, David C. Lavery, L.S., David Aslanian, Guy Ritchie, Gulb, Jack Sadler, Adel Sharizaye, Linda Eason, Griffith Godhand, Robin Milne, Tony O, Ian Brewster, Padraig Okachasich, Susan, AJB, Danilo Gualtieri, Andrew Ratza, Mallory Boyink, Michael Test, Sam, Mark Peregrine, SRD, Bobby Brown, Ed, Joseph Freemel, Caroline, Katerina Czech, Mike, Caitlin Phillip, Jacob Bugdor, Rowan, Shirley Jaramillo, and Cecilia. Thank you.